Talks between senior Chinese and US officials in recent weeks have given hope that the tensions between the world's two great powers could be soon easing. On Crux Decode, we look at whether the recent re-engagement signals a turning point for a more stable relationship, or is the fundamental axis of the relationship between Washington and Beijing going to be one of suspicion and competition? Nearly 4 months after the Chinese balloon incident, a series of public engagements involving Chinese and US officials seem to offer hope. That incident came right before US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was due to make a visit to China. That visit went up in the air, just like the balloon. Now, after 6 months, Blinken is on the cusp of another Beijing visit. But it's taken some while getting here. In late May, the two powers had their first ever cabinet-level exchange in Washington under the Biden administration. Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao had talks with his US counterpart Gina Raimondo, and later also a meeting with the US Trade Representative Katherine Tai. And after a record 5-month vacancy, Beijing finally sent its new ambassador, Xie Feng, to Washington last month. Xie met with US Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland in the last week of May. He followed that up with meetings with Undersecretary of Treasury Jay Shambaugh in the first week of June. Daniel Kritenbrink, the US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, and Sarah Baron, Senior Director for China and Taiwan at the National Security Council, both visited Beijing earlier this month. Blinken's visit is expected to cap off all of these senior-level diplomatic engagements between Beijing and DC in the last few months. But experts in both capitals are warning that despite the recent high-level contacts, it is still hard to see light at the end of the tunnel for US-China relations. There is persistent and deep mutual distrust, and also very little time left for both Washington and Beijing to mend their fences. Instead, the two powers might be entering a new reality in which engagement is aimed solely at managing differences wherever their interests collide. It could be a new kind of Cold War. In late May, following a 10-hour meeting between Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and China's top diplomat Wang Yi in Vienna, the US President Joe Biden said that the balloon incident, according to him, was silly and that he expected a thaw with Beijing very shortly. The two countries now seem to be trying to pick up the momentum that they gained from the Biden-Xi Jinping meeting that happened in Bali, Indonesia, on the sidelines of the G20 last November. At that meeting, they had decided to improve tactically with cabinet-level visits between Beijing and Washington. But neither side is setting its sights or its expectations too very high. While that might be the view from Washington, which is slightly more rosy, slightly more positive, the view from Beijing is much more circumspect. Many Chinese experts feel that recent developments do not necessarily equate to China and the United States moving towards some kind of a substantive and clear improvement in their ties. Dialogue and communication and what results they produce are completely different matters altogether. Now, according to think tanks associated with the Chinese Foreign Ministry, US-China tensions had been intensifying between the bilateral meeting that happened in Bali in November between the two principals and the G7 summit in Hiroshima last month, which too, there was no indication of any significant or lasting relief on any single major dispute that is vexing this relationship. Experts also held a rather dim view about the timeline that is available to repair ties given the pressing US presidential election cycle. By the time 2024 rolls in, and especially if it's going to be a Biden versus Trump rematch, there is likely to be far less elbow room for any kind of thaw. The Biden administration will not want any perception that it is soft on China during the campaign season. But the real drive for change, normalization, or at least an ability to pretend not to be adversarial to each other, that is being pushed in a big way by America's corporate community. In recent weeks alone, multiple US CEOs and influential business leaders have been visiting Beijing. Elon Musk of Tesla, Warren Buffett of Berkshire Hathaway, and of course Tim Cook of Apple were all in China in recent weeks. The way corporate America sees the relationship between Beijing and DC, they would want, at least on the trade front, a semblance of normalcy. China and the United States have benefited enormously in the last 30 years as China became the factory of the world. That resulted in cheaper goods for American consumers and more jobs and better livelihoods for ordinary Chinese. Even at the height of their tensions in 2022, China and the United States traded more than $700 billion of goods and services. That is the highest between any two countries on the planet. The other aspect regarding US-China ties is how analysts are cautious and expecting the window, which is already a narrow one and perhaps even entering its final stage, this window could last perhaps only till August to September, or at the very best till the end of this year. And that is because the presidential cycle for 2024 will kick in all earnestness starting January of next year. So, is there a possibility of improvement in the next couple of months? Well, if you're an optimist and prefer to see the glass as half full, then yes, there is a glimmer of hope. Of course, we don't know if the United States really feels or understands this urgency of the next 2 or 3 months. It is now going to be a test. Certainly, there is a view that the next 2 or 3 months could be the most important in US-China relations for the next at least year and a half. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, for example, has said that the United States has no intentions of using trade and trade constraints in a bid to try and stifle China's rise. But Beijing has still accused Washington in early May of applying export controls to contain and bring down not just China, but also a large number of developing countries. The Biden administration has repeatedly said it's not seeking another Cold War or conflict with China. Washington recently aligned with its allies to assert that what it was really looking for in its relationship with China was to de-risk and not to decouple. That's a message that has not gone down well in Beijing. While in Europe last month, Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang was still warning that a certain country, without naming that country, but it's obvious to everyone that was an apparent reference to the United States, a certain country is waging a new Cold War. Those were his words. There is also an easing in economic ties. The US-China trade relationship, like I mentioned before, has been rising steadily for the last few months, and this is despite the tumultuous phase which really began from the Trump era and lasted all the way through the aftermath of COVID. This was according to a report released by the US-China Business Council on the 25th of May. But whether this thaw in trade can lead to an overall warming up of ties, that is still an open question. Whether the titans of Wall Street will prevail over the mandarins at Foggy Bottom remains to be seen.